So, what would I do if I could create my own students? I approach this question with a certain amount of hesitancy. It's not that I can't say clearly what I would like my students to be when they arrive in my classroom. That's a relatively easy thing to do. What's difficult about the question is the realization that the act of creating that ideal student is much more than just giving a list of certain qualities. It involves the much larger and more difficult question of how ought children to be educated, which involves, in turn, an even more difficult and dangerous question: how ought children to be raised? Not just with respect to their time in school, mind you, but with respect to the whole of their life. For a student is, after all, a human person. The question of how to raise chickens doesn't scare me very much. If you mess up, the worst thing that you have is a bunch of dead chickens. Not that catastrophic. But the question of how best to raise children, I think, if I think about it too much, can be almost paralyzing. It makes me think sometimes that God seems a bit too trusting in giving them to us. But perhaps it is also part of God's wise plan that once one is actually engaged in the act of raising one's own children, one has almost no time at all to think about how to do it. You just have to do it. I'm not any sort of expert in anything except for maybe the Bible. I don't have some enormous long track record of university teaching to draw from, nor any particularly original insights into the nature of things when it comes to raising children. So, insofar as possible, I'm going to remain focused on the easier question, not how to raise children in general, but simply on those things in their upbringing that seem to me to tend towards making children ready to be good students at the university level. So again, what would I do if I could create my own students? I'm reminded after hearing this question of the way that British novelist and humorist Douglas Adams began one of his books in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. He said, "In the beginning, the universe was created." This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. None of us here, thank God, has the task of creating the whole universe. Even if we could, we would probably think better of it and go find something less stressful to do. And yet, oddly enough, it has been recognized since many thousands of years ago that we human beings do have a task that includes the whole universe. The ancient Hebrews saw this more clearly than their neighbors. In the mythological accounts of creation that their neighbors wrote down, the material universe is depicted as a sort of cosmic accident, with the betrayal and death of greedy and needy gods at its center. Humans are, in this picture at best, just slaves to the physical forces and distasteful gods whom they serve, out of fear of an annihilation that's inevitable anyway. It's really depressing. If you ever get a chance to read ancient Near Eastern literature outside of that found in the Bible, just don't. It won't edify you very much, and after all, we biblical scholars don't like the competition. Leave it to the geeks. But one thing reading this extra biblical ancient Near Eastern literature does do is make you realize how profoundly unique the literature of the Bible is. It is of an entirely different order. Even from a merely human point of view, the Hebrews were the most unique thinkers ever to walk the face of the earth, mostly because they were utterly convinced that at the heart of reality was joy and goodness and life. That was at the heart of reality. C.S. Lewis remarked in one of his books, I think it was Mere Christianity, how strange it was that if people should come up with this idea, that if people looking out on this fallen world of ours, which is just riddled with all sorts of problems and a tendency towards its own destruction, really, would come up with the conclusion that the heart of all of this is something good, someone good. What a strange idea. But this is what the Hebrews knew. They knew the real God, and they knew that He was good, and they knew that the universe that He had made was good. So when they wrote down their own account of things, they didn't merely correct, the wrong ideas of their neighbors. In fact, they didn't even dignify those wrong views with a direct response. What they did instead was, instead of telling them how they were wrong, they simply showed them how they were wrong by giving the true and beautiful account of how things really are. And in doing so, primarily in the book of Genesis, they began to teach. They began to teach the whole world the ultimate account of reality. The ultimate account of reality was this: in the beginning, the universe was created, and this ought to make everyone very happy. Not sad, not upset, not angry, very happy. So, among other things in this cosmic pedagogy, they wrote down in the early pages of the book of Genesis the very first commandment that God gives to the first man and woman. So, what's the first commandment? Well, actually, the first commandment in the Bible given to the first man and woman is this. It's almost preposterous, you think about it, especially if you read this in light of other ancient Near Eastern literature about humanity. God says to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion. That's the first commandment in the Bible, given to humanity. In plain English, this is basically God saying, here, my children, is a universe. Go be its king and queen. What an incredible view of humanity. You see, the real God isn't greedy or needy the way that their neighbors sort of image the gods. He's totally self-sufficient. And this allows him to be totally generous. He doesn't need the universe. And to prove it, his first act after getting it all done is to give it away. Here you go. To those strange creatures he made, as it says, in his own image and after his likeness. He gives it to them, the first man and woman. In this, he reveals not only his own infinite largesse, and at the same time, however, the almost divine dignity of humankind in its task with respect to the whole universe. But notice that tucked away there at the beginning of this command, to be king and queen of the creation, is another command. A command that involves an even higher dignity than being king and queen of creation. Well, what dignity could possibly be higher than being king and queen of creation? There's only one that I can think of. The dignity of being themselves creators. So God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Now, most of us in the room over the age of 25 or 30 have decided to do just that. For better or for worse, as we ourselves said it, right? Be fruitful and multiply. It's a strange thing being married, isn't it? You and your spouse, as king and queen of your own little domain there, you basically set up shop in some small corner of this cozy little cosmos of ours, and then you hang a little sign out in the window that says, "Wanted, little people from another world." And by Jove, 9 months later, there they are. A little person from another world, that is basically an alien, is living in your house. How did this happen, right? Well, it's too late for that question now. The little alien is your responsibility. And whatever else you may be doing in terms of a profession or a career or a craft or whatever, it's your life's real work to do your level best to teach the poor little thing how to be a human being. Right? It's from another world. You got to teach them how to be a human being. So, as Shakespeare's Hamlet put it, what a piece of work is man. What a piece of work indeed. What a monumental mountain of work it takes to make just one good sort of human person. But it's also, of course, the best sort of work, the best sort of creation that we can create, the noblest of all professions. As one of my favorite early Christian writers put it, St. Irenaeus, the glory of God is mankind fully alive. The glory of God is mankind fully alive. In other words, when a human being is fully alive, fully human in every respect, that is the glory that God seeks. Now, with regard to the human person, the Hebrews also disagreed about this with their neighbors. But in one point at least, pretty much all of the philosophies and religions of East and West are in basic agreement on this one point with regard to the human person. There's something fundamentally screwed up about human persons. Okay, everybody kind of across the board agrees about this. The noblest of the Eastern approaches to the problem of the human person tend to see something intrinsically wrong about the very notion of personhood. The person is the ego, and the grasping ego is obviously not good. Ego is understood then as an illusion, and living in this illusion of the self is the problem. The solution is to be liberated from the illusions and egotisms of the self into a serene and selfless participation in the all-encompassing consciousness. And let's face it, there are certain days of the week when dissolving one's self into a serene and unself-conscious, state sounds really, really nice. But the Western approach, starting with the Hebrews and kind of finding a finality in Christianity, disagrees with this. It is admittedly the more difficult approach of the two. It says in response to the Eastern view that personhood is something more than just grasping ego. There's more to it than that. The grasping is actually a distortion of true personhood, not its essential manifestation. Personhood itself is a good. In fact, it's the highest good that there is. So, to the classical Western view, the Eastern idea of dissolving personhood to solve the problem of the person would be like using decapitation to solve a toothache. It does fix the problem, but not really the way you want it. So, on the other hand, the Western approach to the problem recognizes that human persons are fundamentally wounded, broken even, and that they need serious fixing, transformation of some sort. So the whole classical tradition of the West has seen the true solution to this brokenness and the transformation of the human person in a very personal way. That is, it has to do with a person's relationships. Get relationships right and you get everything right. Get them wrong and nothing else is going to make it right. But which relationships? Well, the classical tradition gives us 4 basic relationships. We're good because really there are only 4. It's all very mathematical. There is your relationship to that which is less than you, or sort of lower on the ladder of being than you are. First of all. The second one, your relationship to that which is you, your relationship to yourself. The third, your relationship to that which is equal to you. And finally, your relationship to that which is greater than you are. So less than you, identical to you, equal to you, greater than you. Those 4 relationships. Aside from being our kingdom, the cosmos is also our classroom. So if we restate these 4 relationships in terms of a student in the cosmic classroom, we get this. The relationship of the student to nature, that which is less than you. The relationship of the student to themselves, that which is you. The relationship of the student to their peers, that which is equal to you. And finally, the relationship of the student to their teachers, that which is greater than you, or at least we hope that they're greater than you. So, and you who are tired now can go home because you have the basic answer. The question is, what would I do if I could create my own students? The answer is, I would do this. I would create students who from a very young age who had been habituated to getting these 4 relationships more or less correct, more or less right. That's the short answer. If you want the long answer, you have to stick around a little longer. So, let's talk a little bit about that first relationship, the relationship between the student and nature. I'll start here with something that I have often asked classrooms full of college freshmen who are in an introduction to theology class that they had to take to fulfill some stupid requirement that has nothing to do at all with their real degree, which is in business or architecture or gender studies or oriental basket weaving or whatever. I ask them this. I say, does anybody know where the word student comes from? What its root meaning is? Nobody ever knows, but I ask it anyway. Does anybody here know? Yeah, that's because you're geeks. So student comes from this Latin word studere, which actually has this notion to be zealous for something, to be eager for something. So I tell them this. I say, when you're a student, it means to be eager to know. Huh, I see some of them thinking, why would they use that word to describe me? That's so weird. Yes, why indeed, but that is what the word means. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who kind of represents the Western classical tradition, says, begins one of his books this way. He says, wonder is the beginning of wisdom. The experience of wonder is what makes one a student. What makes one eager to know. That experience of like, what's that about? Makes one eager to know, zealous for knowledge. And in the normal order of things, I think it is basically the experience of nature that first causes wonder. So therefore we might rephrase, wonder is the beginning of wisdom, and say this instead. That which causes wonder is the beginning of wisdom. And a right relationship with nature is what causes wonder. In other words, finally then, a right relationship with nature is what makes one able to be a student. So, what is it to have a right relationship with nature? Well, at the very least, it would mean having first-hand experience of nature, the natural world, and lots of it. My ideal student that I am creating here would spend a lot of time, especially as a kid, outdoors, in nature. And this would be natural to them, not contrived, not let's get on a bus and drive 4 hours to go to the nature center and experience nature, right? They would be brought up in an environment where they were simply by habit led to like the whole world. Trees and flowers and mushrooms and bugs, and animals and mud and all of the weather and the sun and the moon and the stars and all that stuff. Aristotle said this. He said, nothing is in our intellect that was not first in our senses, in one of our 5 senses. So nothing's in our intellect that's not first in one of our 5 senses. There's a certain danger, particularly real in our culture, of subjecting the senses of children so repeatedly to what is artificial that this, like anything, becomes an intellectual habit. This habituation leads them to a kind of reflex in which they tend to think that the artificial is what's normal and natural, and that what is truly natural is at best kind of weird. And by the way, in our culture, this is just as real a danger to kids who live in the country as in the city. It has much more to do with parents than it does with place, and sort of what things parents sort of propose as good and worth doing. In our current context, the greatest poison, I think, to a child's development of a right relationship with nature is modern gadgetry. Kids often, even in the classroom, have more time-wasting toys than they know what to do with. They have video games and television and canned music and movies and even, God help us, computers and iPhones. If those are the things, if these are the things that children are habitually spending time with, and thereby being habituated to think are natural, normal, then they are at the same time being habituated to think that what is truly natural is not. Oh, but it's an educational video game. No, it isn't. At best, it's a waste of time. Whatever we do or do not do is forming habits of thought and action in us. Whatever we do or do not do is forming habits of thought and action in us. Let me illustrate with an extreme example from the history of philosophy. There was a French mathematician turned philosopher by the name of René Descartes, who spent a little too much time by himself in a heated room, sort of cut off from the natural world. He's the guy credited with having written, "I think, therefore I am," right? You've all heard that. The reason he had to resort to this very odd way of speaking was that he had sat for so long in his room, sheltered from the real, that he utterly distrusted the reality of the natural world. So he sat there and thought himself and everything else out of existence. And then tried really hard to figure out another more clear and certain way of being sure that things really existed. You could be sure about it. A way more certain than the obvious evidence of his own senses. His meditations read like the diary of a madman, entertaining as a real thought that the whole universe might be not only a mirage or an illusion, but worse, the trick of an evil creator who might be out to deceive him by means of his five senses. And this is the father of modern philosophy. No wonder we're so screwed up, right? Another French philosopher, much later, Jacques Maritain, later prescribed a very good cure for Descartes' self-inflicted unreality. He said that what Descartes really needed to fix his wrong relationship with nature was to go out and milk cows. This would fix it. Being one of those philosophical types myself, I actually keep a couple of milk cows on the farm for this very purpose. And so I can have as much cream as I want in my coffee. So number one, if I could create my own students, they would have a love for the natural world and a trust in their senses and the true eagerness to know that come from experiencing it habitually. Through this, they would be habitually what we might call wonderful people. People who habitually have the desire to know. The number one problem that any university professor teaching any subject today faces isn't that kids are ignorant. It's not that. We professors actually prefer a certain amount of ignorance. It's job security for us. So ignorant they may be when they come in, but that's not the problem. No, the number one problem is that they have no wonder. The student does not care, which is just to say that the student is not really a student. Ignorance is just a lack. It's a kind of emptiness, which can easily be filled. But apathy, to be quite candid, is a demon. It has an inclination positively set against any attempt to fill it. So much, then, for the relationship with what is below the student. On to the next one, the relationship with that which is the student's relationship with himself. One of my all-time favorite sayings of Aristotle, and I'm not quoting here, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's something to this effect, from his book on the ethics. He's discussing pain and pleasure, and how they sort of correlate with respect to action. And he says this. He says, youth is pleasant because it is rather like being drunk. Well, a drunk person may find being drunk for all sorts of reasons, but all of them come down to one basic reason. It's a temporary suspension of the right use of reason. So childhood is pleasant then because, no offense to any children here, there's not too many good, it's pleasant because it is a sort of temporary suspension of the right use of reason. This is what childhood is in a certain respect. So if the first step in creating my own students is in teaching them how to habituate themselves to wonder that comes from experiencing nature, the second step in creating my own students would be teaching them to become reasonable. Kids don't come ready-made reasonable, not even close, really. Remember, they come from another world, right? So just keep that metaphor in mind. So what is the first step to introduce your little person from another world into the way we do things in this world? This is how we do things here. That is to introduce them to reason. How do you do that? Well, here's what the first step is not. Oddly enough, the first step is not reasoning with them. It's a somewhat incongruous thing to see parents or educators of the young giving very rational explanations and lectures to a small child who is laying on the floor kicking and screaming. I've seen this more than once. It's one of the main reasons I decided to go into higher education instead of elementary education. After all, I understand the parents. I'm on their side. Good argument. But I'm sure that the child does not understand and is definitely not on the parents' side. You might as well argue with a brick. In fact, it would be easier to argue with a brick, because even though a brick is not for you, well, at least it's not against you. Not so with a tantrum. So Aristotle might say that youth is pleasant, because it's like being drunk. But that just means that parenting, educating the very young, can sometimes be very unpleasant, because it means dealing with lots of little drunk people, from another world. It's been a long time. It's been a long time since I had the personal experience of being a child, or being drunk. But I think I know a little bit, at least, of what Aristotle is pointing us toward. He said that wonder is the beginning of wisdom, but the Hebrews, being a little more aware of the whole human brokenness that we call original sin in theology, they had a little more realistic view of things. When they wrote the Bible, they didn't say what Aristotle said. Aristotle said, wonder is the beginning of wisdom. The Hebrews said, fear is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord, in particular. Fear is the beginning of wisdom. Love is the end of it all, but the beginning is fear. The Hebrew book of Proverbs put it this way: if you spare the rod, you will spoil the child. One of my sisters reversed this a little. She said it's more practical if you turn that proverb into a command. It should therefore read thus: spare the spoil, just rod the child. She has 8 very good kids, so I guess she has the right to pontificate. In any event, but what does all this have to do with my imaginary student that I am creating? Well, first of all, it's not about the merits or demerits of corporal punishment. That's not what I'm interested in speaking about here. What it is really about is this: in terms of their relationship with themselves, my ideal student would be habituated to what an older tradition used to call self-conquest, and what more current parlance might call learning to control themselves, or more positively stated, they would be what we now call self-motivated, in a good way. So there's a universe of difference between finding ways to control children and habituating children to control themselves. Television, for example, is a very effective way of controlling children, but it's the opposite of habituating them to control themselves. There's a world of difference between wanting to be self-motivated and actually being self-motivated. In a natural setting, it seems to me the ordinary way of making sure that this habituation to self-conquest happens is physical labor. As St. Paul once said it, if you don't work, you don't eat. The problem is that in our culture, it has increasingly become the norm for us to separate ourselves from any real and immediately visible dependency on work. Dad disappears for several hours every day. Somehow or other, everything that we need for a very comfortable and pleasant life magically appears. I remember, I grew up on a farm, but I remember even as a kid begging my mom for something at the store, and she said, I don't have any money. And I said, well, just write a check. What a dumb kid, right? And yet, this has come to be, in a certain respect, the way we all think on a much larger societal scale. In this age of extreme comfort and convenience and societal safety nets, we practically have to make special efforts and decisions to make ourselves more immediately and obviously dependent on tangible physical work in order to gain thereby the habitual correct attitude toward labor of other kinds, particularly of an intellectual kind. Let me use an example. So in our house in Michigan, we have very cold winters. We could heat our house with propane, but for a number of reasons, we chose to shut the furnace off and to heat with a wood-burning stove. It's a chore. But along with milking cows and stuff, it's a wonderful tool for habituating kids to self-motivation and self-conquest. If I said they always like doing these chores, I would be lying. But it at least makes a movement in that direction more likely to happen than not. Look, if you don't go get wood and bring it in, you will freeze. See, I told you, now we are freezing. Go get wood. Then they bring the wood in, and are rewarded immediately with warmth and light. What a nice, obvious, tangible, immediate, positive reinforcement for self-conquest and self-motivation. Next time, the kids won't wait until the house is so cold that we have to put milk in the refrigerator to warm it up. You think I'm joking, but this actually happened. Rather, they will be getting into the habit of self-motivation to do the chore of going out into the coal and getting the wood while it's still warm inside. Now, here's the real crux of the matter. Physical labor is really the only natural paradigm for coming to understand the value of intellectual and spiritual labor. All learning starts with what is more obvious to us, and then moves into what is less obvious to us. So here's what is more obvious. If you don't get wood, your body will freeze. Now, once this is all clear, it can be used to teach the less obvious. If you don't learn grammar, your brain will freeze. Right? Use these things. It's good. So number 2, if I could create my own students, they would be habituated by experience of physical labor to acting on the principle that good things come to those who work. Study, being a student, is inevitably tedious or difficult at times, maybe even most of the time. It's hard. And even when it isn't tedious or difficult, there's almost always something else, anyway, that seems more immediately pleasant and beneficial or whatever. But in my ideal students, habituated to self-conquest, the reflex response to the tedium and pain of learning would be to make themselves work at it. The number 2 problem that any university teacher today faces, it's not necessarily that kids are lacking in a goodwill. Generally, they want to please you, or at least they want to pass. They want at least that. They may even be truly eager for learning. But this desire for a good thing is no good to them because they lack the habit of doing, which would make them able to turn their good desires into a good reality. In short, they don't know how to work, period. Even if they care, they are not habituated to making themselves do difficult and unpleasant things. As far as being a student goes, the relationship with the self has to be one of self-conquest, self-motivation. So much then for the relationship with that which is the student. Now on to number 3, the relationship with those things that are not the student, but which are sort of equal to the student, that is their peers. This is perhaps the most fun to talk about because it's ultimately about friendship. I know there are those in the room who know more about friendship than I do, but here again, Aristotle has an important insight. He pointed out that the best things, he says, are the most useless things. This sounds funny at first, but if you think about it, it's absolutely the truth. Useful things are just means to an end. It's the end that we really want. We think of it as good. The most obvious example of this, of course, is chocolate or something like that. It's
fireworks.
Fireworks, good example. utterly useless, but it's kind of what we really want. Yeah, that's actually a really good example. Pencil that in here. Fireworks. That's a better example than chocolate even. Every year or so, my wife finds another article that proves that chocolate is good for you. Fine, but that's not why you're eating it. That's not the real cause of your energy. So, the highest example of this idea, though, the useless things are the best thing, is friendship. You don't love your best friend because they're useful to you. You love them because you love them. Whereas we, sometimes I just like being with them, right? We don't love them to use them. The next time, so the next time you really want, and maybe this is for John Mark here, you really want to give somebody a big compliment, you can go to them and say, you know what? You're really useless. This is high praise. I say this to say that. So, useless things are the best things, and the best useless thing is friendship. This is not to say that true friendship is devoid of usefulness. It's just that usefulness isn't the reason for it. The reason for true friendship is the good of the friendship itself. But this sounds terribly abstract. Speaking more concretely and practically, we might say then that true friendship is based on a sharing of life, a communication of sorts, even conversation. In plain English, sharing life and talking to each other, sharing life by talking to each other. The ordinary way that this happens in life, on a natural level, is through interactions with siblings and other acquaintances, as kids are growing up. The way this usually starts out is not really friendship at all, so much as it is sort of an exercise in learning how communication works and sort of an argument back and forth and this sort of thing, an argument with somebody with whom you disagree. Take a common example from an argument from childhood here. You hit me. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Right? At this point in the conversation, both sides are learning something very valuable. You're learning that mere assertion of something almost never works to convince someone who disagrees with you. So now each side is forced to dig a little deeper. They begin to look for a better way to convince their opponent. Something that will, just by sheer force, make the opponent admit that their view of things is wrong. Oh yeah? Well, you're stupid. Oh yeah? Well, so are you. Darn it, that didn't work either. Let's try another way. The problem seems to be that both of us are basing our arguments on our own authority. Maybe if I used a higher authority, then that would work. Let's try a higher authority. My dad can beat up your dad. No, he can't. My dad could throw your dad over the moon. This keeps not working. What's wrong? I think we need a totally different approach. Let's try this. Want to go ride bikes? Okay, sure. Finally, an agreement. Then they go off and ride bikes. I often tell students that I started thinking when I was about 13 or 14 years old. I'm not too sure what I was doing prior to that point, but whatever it wasn't thinking. So now, of course, I'm just joking. Sort of. But there's a grain of truth to that statement. Prior to really thinking, what I was doing was basically playing at thinking. But as is often the case, the best and most natural games of childhood are a preparation for adulthood. My fantasy student that I am creating would be habituated to enjoy conversation, both speaking and listening. They would learn how to tell a story, how to explain things, how to make an argument in their own favor, how to make an argument in somebody else's favor, how to discuss and disagree and listen, and how to relate, how to ask questions, how to go about answering them. They would be habituated to take pleasure in the whole art of conversation. So my number 3 fantasy for the students I'm creating is that they would be habituated by long familiarity to speaking with other good people about good things. They would at least have made a good beginning in the whole art of conversation. Despite all appearances to the contrary, no university professor wants to be the only one who talks in the classroom. The number 3 problem, then, that university professors experience with students is an inability to converse with others intelligently, either in speech or in writing. Often we encounter students who may have good desires, and they may even have good personal capabilities, kind of individually, but who are hampered in the real fruition of learning, in that they do not know how to communicate interpersonally. There are 2 extremes. So the first extreme is more like friendliness, in that it's interested primarily in kind of getting along with others. This is especially prominent in today's young people. They're generally very nice. They want to get along with people. The problem with this, especially in the classroom, with this attitude is that it very easily devolves into an intellectually lazy attitude that basically anything that anyone says is true, or that nothing is really so important that you need to really hold fast to it and, God forbid, actually argue about it. And this is something, it's a real problem sometimes, where there's an inability to sort of follow a train of thought for very long, especially if you begin to see that this is going to be a real divergence here and we're actually going to disagree. They're scared of that. The other extreme is the less common but equally unhelpful kind of opinionated self-assertiveness that can only see what it sees and not see what anyone else sees. Instead of saying anything that anyone says is true, it tends towards saying only what I say is true. So if we back up and ask how to avoid these extremes and end up in the middle, how do we do it? It seems to me that as children, the ideal educational setting would be one that encouraged and habituated students to conversation. A school would need to be big enough that students have to interact with others, siblings and peers and whatever, and yet small enough so that the students actually have a relationship with each other that habituates them to real conversation. This leads then to our final relationship, that between the student and the teacher. Since the last part is all about the student's relationship with what is better than he is, the primary habit to speak about here is the habit of receptivity. Being receptive to that which is better. Every teacher wants students who are receptive. Not just in the sense of wanting to receive what you have to give them, but more importantly in the sense of being able to receive what you have to give them. And what a university professor has to give is not simply information of the type that can be gotten from reading stuff. If that were the case, we could all just sit alone at home and read things and come out truly educated. Much cheaper, much easier. But we instinctively know, don't we, that there's something in the give and take between teacher and student, meeting face to face, that really cannot be replicated by books or even by audio or video conferencing. No offense, Jake. No, there's something that a student gains from a really present teacher that he cannot get any other way. This doesn't mean that the university professor is the source of all knowledge on his topic and that the student should just sort of be a passive receiver. That attitude can actually be just as deadly to real education as an ill will. What a professor really desires and needs in order to be an effective teacher is students who are what we might call active receivers. These are students who have all the other three things that we talked about. They've got wonder, the ability to be a student, zeal for learning. They've got self-motivation to make themselves do this. And they've got the art of conversation, the give and take. But on top of this, they have something more. What an older tradition called piety, actually, and what our modern parlance might call respect, or even a kind of reverence. This does not mean anything slavish. Rather, it means the habitual recognition that as a student, you are being welcomed by your teacher, not only to a higher place with respect to the particular branch of knowledge that the teacher is teaching, but more than that, you're being welcomed into a higher kind of life. That life that is the community of the wise. Something that has slowly dawned on me since my undergraduate days is that what I thought I was learning and what I was actually learning are two very different things. What I thought I was there to learn were subjects. You know, I read and studied it all, from Aristotle to Shakespeare to Einstein and everybody in between. But I wasn't just learning a kind of dead encyclopedic knowledge of things from books. What I was really learning, and this is the key here, was a habit. I was learning how to read and how to think and how to communicate with wise people. Both the living, my teachers, and the dead, the people we were reading mostly. I was being led into a higher kind of life. That was my real education. Education itself, educate, it's an interesting word. It comes from educere in Latin, literally meaning to lead out. I was being led out of simply playing at thinking and playing at wisdom, as it were, into actually possessing them in some way as a real habit, a real power and character in my soul. And you can't really learn this habit from reading stuff. You can only really learn it by having a right relationship with someone who already possesses it. Aristotle has only 4 or 5 humorous quotations in his writings. I think I've used them all up already. So we'll turn now to a more abstract principle that he designated, talked about. St. Thomas Aquinas coined it thus: whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. Now that sounds horrible, but if you're good, I won't quote it to you in Latin. It's not that bad really, as it sounds in either language. Here it is again. Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. Example. So if I take a cup of water and I pour it on the floor, it's received according to the floor's mode. That is, it's flat and extended. So I get a flat, extended puddle in 2 dimensions, right? If I take the same water and I pour it into a cup, then I get something different, don't I? It's received according to the mode of the cup, which is sort of hollow, cylinder, or whatever. Now the water actually stands up in 3 dimensions, has a total, another dimension that the water on the floor lacks entirely. So the receiver sort of determines how the thing is received in a certain way. So how does this help with my students that I'm creating? Well, it's like this. To continue with the earlier metaphor of water. University professors have a lot of water. What often we find in students, students who come to university not with a pool or a bucket or even just a teaspoon. They come instead with an iPhone. Something that actively inhibits receptivity. So we get a lot of this during class. Yeah, so you got to use texting, you know, while this is going on. And I was talking to the president of the university where I taught last semester. He asked me how things were going in my classes. This was at the point of the midterms exams, and I said the classes seem to be going pretty well overall. I said, but I had one instance of a student cheating on an exam. Cheating on an exam on the Bible, of all things. All the things to cheat on. My gosh. Anyway, he had been seen, you know, sort of busily, but semi-covertly looking up answers to the exam on his iPhone. He still failed. But anyway, the president listened very patiently to my story, nodded knowingly, and then said, "Ah, yes, smartphone, dumb kid." That pretty much summarizes it. A university professor, whether he's good, bad, or indifferent as a teacher, by the mere fact that he's made it that far, has an ocean to give to students. It's bad enough if all they bring to the classroom, you know, is a teaspoon. It's impossible if all they bring, you know, are the habits, which are kind of perfectly symbolized by the iPhone. You know, texting when they think that the professor is looking, total lack of focus, the notion that knowledge comes from machines, you know, far away, complete lack of respect for real people who are right in front of you, etc., etc. So, what I want to make clear that this receptivity to what is better than you is not simply a quantitative thing, you know, as the difference between one student and another. It's not just sort of like, oh, this student has a teaspoon and that student has a bucket or whatever. More importantly, in my ideally prepared student, it would be a qualitative difference. You know, like the water in the cup that has a dimension that the water on the floor just doesn't have. Let's use another analogy. The sun shines on everything, but it's received very differently according to the mode of the thing that receives it. A rock, for example, receives sunlight simply as heat. It's a kind of energy, but nothing more. A plant receives sunlight as the source of photosynthesis and nutrition, right? Something more than mere energy. It receives it as a basic kind of life, a very basic kind of life and growth. An animal receives sunlight as sensation, a totally different and higher kind of receptivity than the plant or the rock has. Now, a human being receives the same sunlight as a kind of knowledge, based on sensation and vision. Again, a higher order of things altogether than the other. So, to apply the analogy to our topic, the role of a teacher, especially in the younger years, is really, really difficult. Much more difficult than the role of a university professor in some ways. The role of an elementary educator isn't so much to shine brightly, that's for us college professors, but rather to to take the rocks and the plants and the animals and the little drunk people and the aliens from another planet, you know, who come into the classroom, and to lead them out into a totally new and better kind of life, to help them become something new, something for whom the sun shines not just to warm and feed them, but so that they can see and know. The number 4 problem, we're almost there, that the university professor faces is that their students, even when they have the habit of wonder, self-motivation, conversation, they still lack something. That something is the attitude that makes one able to be a disciple. Discipulus, you mentioned those. So this does not mean uncritical acceptance of everything the professors say. I'm the last person to advocate for that. I intentionally say false things in class sometimes just to see if they're awake. So rather, it's an attitude founded naturally, I think, in the relationship between parents and children. So on a natural level. On a supernatural level, it's also the relationship between the individual and God. St. John Bosco said this about the teacher-student relationship. He said, get them to love you and they will follow you anywhere. So how to get them to love you is a ticklish matter. But my ideal student would be the one who had habitually experienced the love and respect of his parents and teachers, and who had been guided into the habit of returning that love and respect to those who are over him. So often in the big university setting, the teacher-student relationship is something like, you know, a relationship between anybody looking something up on the internet and Wikipedia, me empty of knowledge, you full, you fill me up quick, you know this knowledge. And then after, they come to you and they ask you these questions, and so you go and you spill your heart out to them. You've done your level best to give them your whole heart full of wisdom and wonder and joy and ecstasy of beholding the truth. You lead them right up to it, and you, wow, isn't that amazing? And then comes the inevitable question, the question that ends all questions, the question that makes a university professor almost despair. Is that going to be on the test? I'm reminded of the passage in Genesis where Jacob is cooking a pot of stew, and a famished Esau comes in from an unlucky hunt and says in very clunky Hebrew something like this, gimme now red stuff, that. And he gets the red stuff, but he pays for it by giving away his birthright. Our birthright as human beings, created in the image and likeness of God and recreated through grace, is to be like God, to think and to love and to act like God does, to share that kind of life. No longer do I call you slaves, Jesus said, but rather I call you friends. Discipleship is a kind of friendship with someone who really is your superior in some way. And how do you get disciples? How do you do that? Well, Christianity has a special insight here, I think. When God wanted to save fallen humanity, when he wanted to seek out and save that which was lost, he didn't start a ministry, he didn't start a school, he didn't make a foundation. What did he do? He simply entered into their life and called them into his life. And I think that's kind of the key that has to go on between, especially with the very young and teachers and students, entering into their life, but not simply leaving them there, calling them out from where they are into something sort of brighter and better. Challenging them, loving them at the same time, both things. But continually calling, and as education indicates, leading them. Okay, so to review and conclude here, get this over with. The 4 relationships are healed by the 4 habits. The 4 habits are, in a nutshell, the habits of wonder, self-conquest, conversation, and discipleship. When students acquire these habits in their elementary education, they will be the best of all students at the university level. But there is something more important than that. And that is that they will be the best sort of human beings. Mankind fully alive. They will be the glory of God. Thanks.